Hello! Today you are going to learn how to use custom database tables with Umbraco V12 and above. Now, in case you didn't know, V12 came with a brand new bunch of entity framework related goodness that's going to make life much easier when you want to work with custom databases. Now, people have been asking me to make this video for a few years, and I think now is the perfect time because V12 is really easy to get up and running. So what we're going to do is go through all the basics, how to set everything up, how to write all the code, and how to read and write data from a database. It's going to be epic. Now, if you haven't come across my channel before we get to the good stuff, don't forget to hit subscribe. Do not be silly. The other things to point out is that if you want to learn more about Umbraco in a book format, I have written a book. It's not very expensive. It's going to help you become an Umbraco ninja. Also, all the code that you're about to see today is part of my Umbraco V12 headless sample site, which is available on GitHub. Finally, I've created a complimentary blog post that goes hand in hand with this video. You can find the link to that below, but that's also going to contain all the instructions, all the steps, everything you need to implement all the tips in this video. With that all done, let's start coding. If you want to use Entity Framework, then the first thing that you need to make sure you have installed is the Entity Framework CLI tool. And if you're unsure if you have this tool installed or not, then you can check using a .NET tool list -- global. Now, if you do have Entity Framework installed, expect to see an entry called .NET -F within your installed app list. And if you do not see this entry within that list, then you can install it using this command. After installing the CLI tool, there's also a few handy NuGet packages that you'll need to make sure you have installed, otherwise this isn't going to work. Now for this video, I'm assuming that you have Umbraco V12 installed, and if you haven't, then I've created a video which is linked to in the related tutorial below, which will cover how to do that. Now, within your project, what you need to do is make sure that you install Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.SQL Server. And because we're using a .NET 7, because we're using V12, make sure that you use the V7 version. Now, additionally, you'll also need to install Microsoft Entity Framework Core.Design. And this will be used to design our database schemas and convert our migrations later on. Now, there is a caveat to this video. I'm going to be working locally and I'm going to be using SQLite, the default database with Umbraco, to do all my Entity Framework stuff in. Now, if you've seen any other one of my videos, I always tell people not to do this. However, for this video, there's actually some extra hidden caveats and extra learnings for using SQLite. So for you, use SQL Manager and everything that I'm about to show you, all the code will work for you. However, we'll go through a few edge cases which will hopefully aid in your learning and prevent you hitting issues when you're setting this up yourself. So if you want to play along at home and use SQLite, then you'll also need to install an additional NuGet package, which is Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite. Now, in order to make sure that our SQLite database gets updated when we run our migrations, I also recommend that you install a SQLite browser. Now, the one that I've used personally for many years is SQLite browser, which you can get from sqlitebrowser.org. If you come down here, you can install the DB browser for SQLite. However, it is probably worth pointing out that if you just want to use Visual Studio Code, there is a SQLite browser for VS Code. It's been downloaded 2 million times, so you could use this as an alternative instead. And the final thing that I want to highlight in this video is that there is some official documentation over at docs.umbraco.com on how to set up Entity Framework with Umbraco. Now, we're going to take a much deeper dive in this video. However, if you get stuck, it's always worth having a read of the official documentation to see if it unblocks you. We've now jumped into Visual Studio and our project. And the first thing that I want to show you is around the app settings.json. So within app settings.json, we can see that we have our connection string, and our connection string is called Umbraco DB DSN. Now remember that I'm using SQLite. So this means that as my connection string, I'm actually pointing to a file on a file server. And if I open up that file, you'll see that we can find it within my web root, within the Umbraco folder, and then within the data folder. And it's called Umbraco SQLite.db. The other thing that I just want to quickly point out here is that you can see that because I'm using SQLite, my Umbraco DB DSN provider name is Microsoft.data.SQLite. Now, if you're using SQL Server, you're going to have a connection string in here, and this is going to have a slightly different provider name. However, at the moment, the important thing to take away is that we have these two properties. The reason why we focused on those database related settings is that our first task is to set up the configuration that will allow Entity Framework to talk to Umbraco. And we'll be doing that in program.cs. Now, in this example, I'm using minimal hosting. So I've only got a single program.cs. However, if you have a startup.cs in your website, you want to add this code there. Now, what you'll see here is I'm doing a web application create builder, and I'm also defining this config option. Now, in all Umbraco websites, in order to register Umbraco on boot up, what we need to do is do this add Umbraco, and in here we're going to add things like the back office, the content delivery API, all that kind of good stuff. Now, as part of Umbraco v12, what we get access to is this brand new helper, so add Umbraco EF core context. The important thing with this is that if we are using a SQLite database, it needs to be placed after add Umbraco and not within it. Now, the reason for this is that by default, Umbraco will struggle to find where the SQLite database is living. Some roots and some paths need to be resolved before this bit will work. Now, when we're creating our add Umbraco EF core context, what we need to do is pass in a context. And this is a class that we're going to create next. So call this whatever you want. And one thing to consider when you're creating context is usually you're going to have a single context for your whole of your application because it uses a singleton pattern. Now, if you look at what this method exposes, what you'll see is it takes in a connection string and it also takes in the provider name. Now, when we installed Umbraco, we set the connection string with an application settings.json, and we don't really want to re-hard code our connection string in program.cs as well. This is the reason why we're using builder.configuration and we're using get connection string, passing in that Umbraco connection string detail, and we're also doing the get connection string provider name, again passing in that same config. And after doing this, we should have the Umbraco EF core database connection context set up and ready to rock and roll. So that covers the Umbraco way of hooking up the entity connection string successfully. Now you might be wondering, why do we need an Umbraco specific way? So let's take a quick look. Now on the screen I commented out the Umbraco way and I put in the more traditional entity framework approach of hooking things up. So we've got services, add DB context, we still pass in our type, and then we've got this options object where we can do use SQLite, or if we want to use SQL Server, passing in our connection string. Using that config, I've now launched my website and I bumped into this issue when I've tried to call Entity Framework. Now the issue is Umbraco CMS persistence IEF core scope provider has got some sort of error. Now, in case you're wondering, this IEF core scope provider is another new thing as part of Umbraco v12 that will allow you to read and write data from your database. Now, we'll cover this at the end of the video. However, hopefully you can see that by using the Umbraco specific activation code, you're going to get access to this scope provider, which will make your life easier later on. We've now hit that stage that if we want to create a user context, it's now got the necessary connection string details so it can talk to our database. Now the next step is to actually create that context so we can build some tables. For this video, I'm going to create a database table called custom users through code. Now I've already run my code and I've got the database created, but you can see it's going to be called custom users. It's going to have two fields, name, surname. If we look over here, you can see that the primary key is the name field, and that's all we need. Now, if we think about this in terms of code, if we want to represent this model within C#, we're going to have to create a brand new POCO or class. It's going to be called custom users. Now it's just going to have some getters and some setters. So from here we've got a name of string, and it's got a name of surname right here. One other really important thing to point out here is around this data annotation. Now this is saying the min length is 6 of this surname property. Now as of EF4, you'll see that annotations can be treated as code first data annotations. And what this basically means is that when Entity Framework sees these annotations, it will try and use it as an instruction on when it creates the field within the database. Now, if it doesn't get this instruction, then we can still do it in config, and we'll get to that later. However, it is really useful to know that you can decorate stuff with these annotations and update the database at the same time. With that POCO defined, our connection string set, we're ready to create our own custom user context. Now remember, in Entity Framework land, the user context is the thing which manages the state between your application and your database. So it's in here, we're going to add all the code to create our tables, we're going to manage some states, all of that good stuff is in that class. So let's have a look at how we create it. We are back inside of Visual Studio, and I've created my context class within this folder called data. You can see here it's called mycontext.cs, and it's living next to that POCO that we just looked at called custom user. Now in terms of this context, you can see that it inherits from DB context, and this means we need to pass in an options object and pass it to the base class underneath it. Now in order for us to access our custom database tables and models in our code, you'll need to define a public property. And what we need to do here is do this db set, pass in the type of POCO, and then this is going to give us a way of accessing our custom users in our code later on. The final thing that we're missing in our class is the actual instructions on how to create the database within SQL or SQLite. Now we add all these instructions in this override method here, which is called onModelCreating. Now this takes a model builder option as an incoming parameter, and this model builder will give you access to a plethora of different methods will allow you to do a load of databasey stuff. Now the method that's probably going to most intrigue you is entity, which you can see is of type T, and you can pass in our POCO that we just created as T. And this is basically going to map a custom database table to that object. So it's basically this line here is where the magic happens of converting database to C# code. The next thing we need to do with an entity is define how we're going to map our object to the database table. So we have things like toTable, where we're going to give the name of our database table that we want created. After that, we can then map or create the fields that we want to use. So you can see that I've got this has key, and this is going to define the primary key. So remember when we looked in SQL, name was set as the primary key. This is the line which was responsible for it. Next, what we want to do is map our properties within our custom users to a database column. So you can see that we're mapping a name to a column called name. We're also mapping this surname to surname. If you do your own research on Model Builder, you'll quickly see that pretty much anything that you can do in SQL, you can map in code because there's tons of options. So quickly before moving on, one thing that's worth pointing out is that say if you just want to create a primary key and you want SQL to auto-generate the ID for you on creation, you can doing something like a value generated on add. You can even mirror this functionality using data annotations. As you'll see here, using the database generated attribute, you can pass in this database generated option identity, and when the database generated attribute is decorated onto a property like this, whenever a new row is added into the database, what will happen is the ID property will auto be generated with an incremental number. So in your day-to-day, you're going to be generating some code that's going to map exactly how you want your database tables to be created. Now, once you're happy and you've created all that code, the next step is to generate some migrations. Now, a migration is basically a script that will then stub up that database within SQL. In order for us to generate one of those migration scripts, we need to jump back to the terminal and use the entity CLI. This means we need to type in a .NET, then EF. Then we want to create a migrations. Then we want to add the first one, which we can call a initial create. You can call it whatever you want. Then we do the context, and then we give it the name of the context we created. So mine was my context. Clicking on this should then create our migrations. Now, in my example, I've already run the script, which is why I'm getting this initial error. But what will happen now is that once we jump back into our Visual Studios, if we look within Solution Explorer, you can see that we have a folder called Migrations now. And then if we look in Migrations, you can see we've got these auto-generated classes. And if we look inside one of these auto-generated classes, you'll see that it contains all the code required to stub everything up within our database. Now that we have our migrations, we'll need a way to actually run them so we can update our database, because at the moment we've just got the scripts. So the quickest and easiest way to run these commands against a database is via the terminal. So I'm back in my SQLite browser. If I refresh, you can see nothing exists. So if I head back to my terminal, what we want to do is a .NET EF database update. If I run this command, you'll see that the build will start. Hopefully the build will succeed. And if we refresh our database, you can see now that we've got a table which is called __EF migrations history. You can also see that we've got our custom user table. And if I open up, you can see that we've got the name and the surname. And just in case you're wondering, __EF migrations history is basically used by Entity Framework to track what migrations have been applied to your database. So having this mechanism to update our database using the terminal is kind of handy when we're working on our own. However, what happens when we want to deploy our changes to production, or we're working within a team and we need to commit changes in source control? Now, because of this reason, what we really want to do is automate when migrations get imported. Now, within Umbraco, we can do this when our web application starts, and we can write code that triggers an application start using a notification handler and something called a composer. Jumping back into Visual Studio, you can see I've created this folder which is called notification handler. And if we open it up, you can see I've created this run DB migrations class. Now, to make something a notification handler, we need to inherit or implement the iNotification async handler, and then we can pass in this Umbraco application started notification. It's also probably worth pointing out that when it comes to building custom notification handlers, in this instance we're using the async version. However, there is also the classic iNotification handler, and then when it comes to the events that you can hook into, if you look in this big list, you can see we've got things like content saving, content saved, published, unpublished, application start. So there is a bunch of events that you can hook into if you weren't aware. Now, as part of this interface, you'll need to implement this handle async method. And it's within this handle async method that we need to add in the code that's going to import any of our migrations. And in order to import migrations, we need access to our context, and this is the reason why we're importing it here. Now, after we've got access to our context, we can do database.getPendingMigrationsAsync. This is then going to give us a list of pending migrations, and then if we have any migrations, we can see that we can migrate to them, or basically run the script, and then this is going to update our database. Now, notification handlers are grand, however, on their own, they won't do anything. And in order to get Umbraco to call this notification handler on startup, we will need to register it using a composer. Now, I'm not really going to go into a deep dive of composers, notification handlers in this video. I've done videos on them, so check my YouTube channel out if you don't know what they are. So finally, switching back to Visual Studio, you can see that I've created this second folder, which is called Startup. And in it, we've got this register composer. In this, I've got the register dependencies, which implements from iComposer. iComposer will force you to implement compose. And then using this builder object, you can then do builder.addNotificationAsyncHandler. You can see that we're passing in the Umbraco application started notification, and then we're passing in that notification handler. So it's called run DB migration. If we go back, you'll see that, run DB migration is the name of the class. This means that now if I go back in SQL, I delete the 2 tables that we created earlier. If I now run my website, go back into my SQLite browser, you can see that the migrations have automatically been run on application startup, and life is grand. So at this stage, you should hopefully know what you get to help you creating custom database tables with Umbraco v12. You should also know how to set everything up and then model your databases in code and have them imported into a database. The final thing to cover in this video is actually how do we access that data and render it in our controllers and our models. So, in order for us to either read data from our database, update records, delete stuff, do all that CRUD goodness, we're going to be using the IEF core scope provider that we looked at the beginning, which was new as part of v12. Now, in this example today, I'm going to be creating an API controller, and using dependency injection, we're going to import this dependency and then use it in our code so we can add our entity framework code to talk to our database. Moving back to our project, you can see that I've created this folder called controller, and then in here we've got my API controller class. And looking at the class, you can see that we're inheriting from Umbraco API controller. Doing this will mean that Umbraco is going to hook up all the routing for us. Now, just in case you weren't aware, you can see that I've got this function, this method here, which is called list users. And the URL for this is going to be umbraco-api-myAPI. My API because it's the name of the controller here, and then list users is going to be the name of the method. And this is how we can quickly and easily create APIs within Umbraco. Now, as mentioned, you can see that we're injecting the IEF core scope provider, and then because it uses generics and it needs a context, we're passing in the myContext object that we've been looking at for ages. Now, in order to start querying the database, what we need to do is define a scope. So we can do a using, and then we can do a create scope. Then we can just do something like an await scope execute with context async. Then we can do an async DB when we can return the custom user table to a list. So don't forget that this custom users property here, this maps to the public property that we created here. So remember we used that DB set, passed in that custom POCO. So this custom users is a C# object that you need to create. Symbols. So moving back to our action, you can see that we've got our scope right here. We've now got the data, read it from the database. We can do a scope complete, and then we can just return an OK and pass in that data. So firing up our site, putting in the Umbraco API, my API list users, we can see that we've now got some data being returned. Now, when it comes to reading data, there are a few hidden gotchas. So you can see we've got our list users here, and then down below, I've created pretty much an identical version. However, this one has an issue. So this endpoint is called error1. And if we go to our website, trigger this endpoint by putting error1 here. So Umbraco API, my API, error1. You can see that we've encountered this error. Cannot access a disposed context instance. Now, going back to the code, the only thing that I've admitted in error 1 is that I haven't converted custom users to a list after I've tried to get everything from the database. So hopefully this error now seems a bit more obvious. In the first example here, I'm reading everything from the database, and this is still scoped to my context. So passing it to a list and adding it into a different brand new object means that it's not attached to a scope anymore, and it works okay. However, in this example, all I'm doing is actually passing back my database scope into comments. Now I'm trying to return it here, which means that is not going to work. As this video is pretty jumbo, I'm not going to go into a deep dive on how to do stuff with Entity Framework and all the CRUD related activities, because there's loads of tutorials out there. However, before we wrap up, let's just look at how we can write data to the database. So At the top here, you can see that I'm using that POCO. I'm defining some new data I want to add to the database. I'm then doing the same kind of scope, create a scope, execute with context. However, this time, what I want to do is the custom users. I'm going to do an add. I'm going to pass in that POCO that we've just created, that object. Then I could do a db.save changes async, and then this is going to store my test code data within my database. Job is a good one. We have made it through to the other side, and you now know everything you need to know in order to start using custom database tables with Umbraco v12. Now, before we go, there's a few housekeeping bits. If you haven't subscribed already, what are you thinking about? Hit subscribe now, man. If you have got value from this video, help me out, click like and show me some love. Otherwise, if you just want to learn more about Umbraco before moving on to the next video, then on the screen right now, there's a link to Umbraco v12, and it's going to contain all the new features aside from this custom database stuff. So check that out. Otherwise, until next Sunday, happy coding. With that all done, let's start coding. Finally, I've created a complimentary blog post that goes hand in hand with this video. You can find the link to that below, but that's also going to contain all the instructions, all the steps, everything you need to implement all the tips in this video.